We are currently living through one of the most starkly unequal economic periods in human history. A tiny fragment of the population now commands fortunes that dwarf the entire gross domestic product of sovereign nations.
On the surface, the remedy seems straightforward. Simply tax the rich. But there is an uncomfortable, persistent truth lurking beneath the headlines. History has a habit of repeating itself. The more concentrated wealth becomes, the more elusive it is to capture. For thousands of years, governments have attempted to harness the power of concentrated capital. And for thousands of years, the architects of that wealth have quietly, methodically moved it just beyond the reach of the tax collector's hand.
The names of the players change, the legal codes are rewritten, and the fortunes only continue to swell. Welcome to the money truth, where money, power, and the echoes of the past collide, and where nothing is ever quite as simple as it appears.
The Roman blueprint, power writing the rules. To understand why taxing the ultra-wealthy feels like an impossible task today, we must first confront a sobering reality. This is not a product of the modern digital age.
It is an ancient struggle. One of the most revealing chapters of this story begins in the Roman Empire. Rome developed what was, for its time, the most sophisticated fiscal architecture in the ancient world.
The imperial machine required staggering amounts of revenue to sustain its legions, pave its famous roads, and govern a sprawling territory reaching from the damp forests of Britain to the arid deserts of the Middle East.
Taxes were woven into every aspect of Roman life. There were levies on trade, land taxes, provincial tributes, and customs duties. However, the fascinating detail lies in who escaped the net.
The Roman elite, the senatorial class, and the massive landowners frequently paid far less than their fair share. Their wealth wasn't income in the way we understand it today. It was rooted in vast agricultural estates and, most importantly, political influence. Because the individuals drafting the tax laws were often the same men who owned the largest fortunes, they crafted a system that shielded their assets. They shifted the burden onto the provincial populations, the merchants, and the common citizens.
Rome taxed heavily, yes, but it didn't tax where the wealth actually resided. It's a pattern we see time and again. When wealth becomes sufficiently powerful, it begins to rewrite the rules meant to regulate it. Feudal privileges and the path to revolution. Fast forward nearly a millennium, and a remarkably similar drama unfolds in medieval Europe. Kings were perpetually starved for cash.
Wars were ruinously expensive, and the upkeep of castles and royal courts required a constant flow of gold. Yet monarchs faced a recurring nightmare. They could not effectively tax the wealthiest people in their own kingdoms.
In this era, wealth was synonymous with land and feudal privilege. Great nobles controlled massive territories, commanded their own private armies, and held legal dominion over their lands. In many ways, their power rivaled that of the crown.
In exchange for military service or a vague promise of loyalty, these aristocrats secured tax exemptions. Consequently, when a king needed to fill his treasury, he looked toward the path of least resistance. He taxed the trade in the towns. He taxed the rising merchant class. He taxed consumption.
He taxed the economic activity that was easiest to track and seize. Meanwhile, the greatest reservoirs of wealth remained insulated behind walls of legal privilege and political leverage.
By the 18th century, this structural imbalance reached a catastrophic peak, most notably in France. Before the Revolution, the French monarchy was drowning in a sea of debt, fueled by decades of global warfare and royal extravagance.
The state desperately needed revenue, but the two most powerful pillars of society, the nobility and the clergy, were largely exempt from the tax burden.
The weight of the kingdom was carried almost entirely by the third estate, the peasants, the artisans, and the small-scale landowners who possessed the least political power.
By the late 1700s, the system reached its breaking point. Attempts at reform were repeatedly strangled by the very elites who would have had to pay. We often learn that the French Revolution was sparked by bread riots, but beneath the chaos was a structural failure. A tax system that could no longer reach the wealth it needed to survive. When that gap becomes an abyss, societies become inherently unstable. The modern illusion, assets versus income. This is where our story takes a turn into the present. At first glance, our world looks nothing like the Roman Empire or Bourbon France. We don't have a landed aristocracy. We have corporations, global markets, and digital ledgers.
One might assume this makes wealth easier to measure and tax. In reality, the modern structure of wealth has created an even more formidable challenge.
Today, the vast majority of billionaire wealth does not exist as a paycheck. It exists as an asset. This distinction is the engine of modern inequality. Most people understand tax through the lens of income. You work, you earn a salary, and the government takes a percentage. But the ultra-wealthy don't live on salaries.
And the government takes a percentage. Their fortunes are built on ownership. Ownership of stocks, companies, and financial instruments that appreciate over time. The modern tax system is built for the 20th century worker, not the 21st century owner. When an asset increases in value, that gain is unrealized. If a founder starts a company and its valuation jumps from 1 million to 1 billion, they are wealthier on paper. But because they haven't sold their shares, the tax system sees nothing to collect. The wealth is there, tangible and powerful, yet invisible to the traditional tax net.
The buy, borrow, die strategy. You might think, well, they'll have to sell eventually, but modern finance has provided an elegant and perfectly legal detour. Instead of selling shares and triggering a massive tax bill, the wealthy borrow against them.
If you own $1 billion in stock, a bank is more than happy to lend you hundreds of millions at low interest rates, using your shares as collateral. This cash allows you to buy estates, private jets, or new businesses. Because a loan is not income, it isn't taxed.
The underlying shares continue to grow. The owner enjoys the liquidity of a multi-millionaire, and the taxman is left waiting at the door. This cycle is often described by the phrase buy, borrow, die. You buy assets, borrow against their value to fund your life, and when you pass away, those assets are transferred through inheritance structures that often reset the tax basis, potentially wiping out the tax bill forever. For the government, it's like trying to catch a river with a net.
The corporate veil, from profit to expectation. The complexity deepens when we look at the corporations themselves. Much of today's wealth is embedded within massive corporate entities that play by a different set of rules.
Corporations are generally taxed on profits, not their total revenue or their market dominance. This makes sense in theory. We want companies to reinvest, grow, and hire.
But when a company reaches the scale of an Amazon, this mechanism produces a strange paradox. For decades, Amazon prioritized growth over profit. Every dollar earned was funneled back into warehouses, logistics, and new technology. Because their profits were thin, their tax bills were often negligible compared to their size. Yet, while the company reported little profit, its stock price skyrocketed. Investors weren't looking at what the company earned today. They were betting on its future dominance. This means wealth is being created out of expectations. A company can generate billions for its shareholders, while the tax system waits for a taxable event that may be decades away.
The system is designed to capture the fruit, but it has no way to tax the growing size of the tree itself.
Globalization, the vanishing border. If asset-based wealth wasn't complicated enough, there is a second force at play: globalization. For most of human history, wealth was anchored. A factory stayed in one city, a farm stayed in one kingdom. But modern wealth is liquid. Today's corporations operate across hundreds of jurisdictions. They can manufacture a product in one country, register the patent in a second, and book the profit in a third, where the tax rate is lowest. We have a world where governments regulate nationally, but capital moves globally.
This has turned taxing the rich into a game of geography. Countries now compete to offer the lowest rates to attract investment, leading to a race to the bottom, where the ability to tax mobile capital grows weaker every year.
The path forward. Can we adapt? The debate is often framed as a simple matter of political will, just raise the rates. But as history shows, the problem is deeper and more structural. Modern wealth is a shapeshifter. It evolves faster than the law. However, history also tells us that societies eventually find ways to adapt. Income tax was once considered a radical, even impossible idea. Capital gains taxes were created specifically because the old systems couldn't handle the rise of the stock market.
So, how might this system evolve today? Economists and reformers are beginning to look at the buy, borrow, die cycle. One proposal is to limit the amount of stock that can be used as collateral for personal loans.
If you couldn't borrow against your billions, you would be forced to sell shares or pay yourself a salary, both of which the tax system can see and capture.
On the corporate side, some suggest that once a company becomes a dominant market force, its ability to endlessly reinvest to avoid showing profit should be capped. The goal isn't to punish success, but to ensure that when a firm controls an entire sector of the economy, a portion of that value is returned to the public system that makes its existence possible. The final reality: none of these solutions are easy. They require a level of international cooperation that we have rarely seen. And we must remember, wealth doesn't just create luxury, it creates influence.
Just as the Roman senators wrote the laws of the empire, modern interests exert immense pressure on today's regulations. This isn't a conspiracy, it is the natural gravity of power. Money shapes the rules, and the rules protect the money.
When we hear the slogan, "Tax the rich," we are hearing a call for moral clarity. But the real challenge is one of institutional design. Wealth has evolved.
The question is, can our systems of governance evolve with it? If the gap between those who hold the wealth and those who fund the state grows too wide, history suggests the ending is rarely a quiet one.
If this perspective helped you see the world differently, hit subscribe. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.